Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So James, tell me something about your parentage, your mother's family, your father's family, and any influences they had on you.
Well, my father was a senior civil servant in London, but born and brought up in Northern Ireland until the First World War, when at the age, how old would he have been in 1914? He'd have been about 18 or 19. He was called up and served in the, well, he wouldn't have been called up because there were volunteers in those days, but he went as a volunteer and fought throughout the war in the artillery in northern France. Then when he came back, he became a civil servant in London, didn't return to Northern Ireland except on holiday. And my mother, also from Northern Ireland, came of a very large family, which was, well, really both families were rather academic. My father's father was a professor of philosophy and theology in Magee College in Derry, in the north of Ireland. And my mother's family, my mother's parents, were both doctors. And actually my mother's mother was one of the very first women doctors anywhere. And both of them went and spent their lives in India, where they were missionary doctors in India. That was where my mother was born and lived until she was 8, when she was sent back to the north of Ireland and was brought up by relatives in the north of Ireland. Yes, well, my mother's uncles, my father's brothers, one of them was a fellow of Christ's here in Cambridge, and another of them was an eccentric but very brilliant physicist at the National Physical Laboratory. So there was a kind of academic background on both my mother's and my father's side. But in both cases, it was really, my mother's parents' generation were the first generation of academics, and before that, both families had been were really small-scale tenant farmers in the north of Ireland.
Do you feel in any way Irish, or?
Well, I've always felt that I have a double identity. That I feel in. Although I spent all of my life in England, I always went as a child and spent a month in Ireland, and for me it was a kind of wondrous homeland, a place that we always so looked forward to going and staying with our grandparents, and we just found it wonderful. And I think of it as a really essential component of my identity. And I feel really rather strongly that we should be constantly celebrating shared identities, mixed identities, instead of all the appalling nationalism we're forced into by things like football and the Olympic Games and so on, which I think are terribly destructive, where people really are encouraged to have one national identity, instead of celebrating shared identities, which so many of us have, and which I think should be positively valued. Certainly I value mine.
Thank you very much. Did either of your parents particularly influence you? I mean, either your mother or your father, either emotionally or intellectually? Were you very close to either of them?
I think they both influenced me, but in quite different ways. My father died when I was 18. He died of cancer of the lung, and his last 3 or 4 years were really very, very hard for us all. So my teenage years were very much affected by my father's illness and his eventual death. He actually died during the time when I was taking my A-levels at the age of 18. So it was a very difficult time then. But he was kind of quiet and strong and a kind of figure that I felt very close to, but somebody who one would respect rather than be close to. And no, I had a very great admiration for my father. My mother was different. My mother was kind of wild and emotional and enthusiastic, and came from a family that had all the time where there was passionate discussion and arguing, and was anything but restrained. And so there was a total contrast between the restraint of my father and the tremendous enthusiasms of my mother, who was a tremendously kind of warm and loving person, full of enthusiasm and vigor, and really restrained is the very last word that one would apply to her. And she came of a family who shared these characteristics. Lots of strong opinions and arguments and discussions about people, which were often libelous and over the top. And it was a kind of really, I thought, a good atmosphere to be brought up in. All this enthusiasm and kind of often over the top talk.
Where did you go to school? Your first and second schools?
Well, my schooling was much affected both by my father's illness, but also by the war, because when the war broke out, I was 5 years old in 1939.
So you were born in 1934?
I was born in 1934, and so my earliest memories are just before the war started. And then the war came, and that very much affected my education, because for a time we were sent to stay with relatives up in Scotland and in Ireland at the peak of the bombing, because we were living 12 miles south of the centre of London in Purley, which is just near to Croydon, just south of London, which was one of the areas that was most affected by the bombing. Every house in the area where I live was damaged by bombing, and I think around 1 in 10 were destroyed. It was very severely affected, partly because it was on the way home for the bombers coming in from Germany, and those that hadn't dropped their bombs on their targets in London got rid of them as they were going south out of the city, and a number of those fell close to us. But the time of the war and of my early education, it wasn't for me at all a time of trauma. It was a time of excitement. I don't look back to the war as a time of horror or difficulty. It was a time of tremendous excitement, and all of the local children spent all of their time rushing around trying to find pieces of shrapnel, pieces of bomb, and the great prize was to try and find anything with German writing on it. And the local police had a terrible time keeping the squads of small boys away from sites of newly bombed areas. I mean, we were completely, or certainly I was completely uninterested in the carnage and the destruction. What we wanted were relics of the war, and by the end of the war our garage was completely full of these relics.
Does that explain your famous current garages or sheds filled with, which I've heard legendary stories of, filled with jam jars, filled with other things?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we certainly were. Certainly, our family were always accumulators. Yes. Anyway, so that affected my education, and I mean, I went to a succession of often for rather brief periods of local schools, and then, as I've said, for a while I was away in Scotland or Ireland at other schools. I had a brief experience of what I thought was absolutely appalling Scottish education in Greenock, where my uncle lived, where it was a supposedly co-educational school, but the girls were on one side of the classroom and the boys on the other, There was corporal punishment in front of the class for boys, but not for girls. And the girls spent their entire time trying to harass the boys so that they would be beaten in front of the class. And if there was ever a system for encouraging gender hatred, it struck me that that was it. But that was a fairly brief interlude. I mean, I was completely horrified by that, I may say. It really co-educational, but co-educational, creating conflicts between men and women, or between boys and girls. Anyway, at the age of 11, I sat for a range of entrance exams to a series of different schools, and got admission to, got scholarships to more than one school, but eventually went to a local minor public school called Whitgift, which had the advantage of some really very able masters, but also some very incompetent ones. I mean, it was much affected by the war, and the big problem was, that recruitment, obviously, for schools at that time was extremely difficult. So it wasn't an easy time, the education. I mean, and we were, as children, I came of a family we were 3 brothers and a sister, but an awful lot of our time was out of school, was spent rushing around the countryside. We had a radius of about 20 miles from our house that we cycled to, and were constantly out. We had a great concern with natural history. We collected pond life in particular, the 3 kinds of newt. We knew a great deal about water beetles and other pond creatures. And we would cycle all over the area to find rare varieties. It was a time of great excitement. Butterflies we were very concerned with, and we specialized in collecting a rare variety of chalk-hill blue. It's called variety obsoleta. It's a kind of blue butterfly that has a variety which has a shortage of spots on the underside, and we collected rare forms of this, which involved collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of these butterflies and finding ones with this rare forms, and of course releasing the ones that didn't have this rare form. But so it became a kind of really specialist interest, and we were also interested in very many other natural historical things. But that involved really traveling all over the countryside in that area, which we got to know very well.
Which area is this?
This is the area of around 12 miles south of London, but we were on the fringe of open country, and so we were able to extend really over Surrey and part of Kent, cycling widely at that time. And in spite of it being wartime and there being enemy raids, my parents allowed this, and we were able to cycle around.
Were you a
widely.
boarder or a day?
I was a day, always a day school. I'm pleased to say I wouldn't have liked to have been a boarder. And so, no, and so I really got to know the countryside, and that interest in the kind of outdoor world certainly played a part in my later anthropological career.
Because you later stress your interest in hunting and working with hunters and gatherers.
Yes, well, that really was a kind of spin-off from my interest in the countryside and my familiarity with the countryside. We weren't as children, we used to take a little tent and go and sleep out miles from anywhere, and we regarded this as a perfectly usual thing to do. And we would find some lake in a woodland area or something like that, and automatically would go swimming in it. We didn't think anything of that, and so we were entirely used to the notion of wandering around the countryside and exploring it, and it wasn't in any way intimidating to us. It was familiar, and we greatly enjoyed that as children.
What subjects at school particularly attracted you?
Well, I specialized in history, although I was also interested in languages, but for some reason, I don't know quite why, my parents were not keen that I should specialize at school in modern languages, although I did languages. I learnt at school. I particularly French, but I also did at a low level. I did Spanish and Latin, but my parents weren't keen that I should specialize in modern languages for reasons that I really don't know quite what they were. But at any rate, so what I did was the subjects I specialized in were French, and then particularly history, and history interested me a great deal, and that was particularly important, but because there were some gifted teachers of history, and I do think all the time that in any form of education, what really matters is whether you have teachers who are gifted and who provide the right sort of stimulus. And certainly that was the case in history at school, and that was why when I came to apply for the university, I applied for courses in history.
Was there any particular teacher or teachers you remember, their names or having influenced you a lot?
Yes, I mean, there were two people who I remember particularly. One was called Mr. Hadza, I can't remember his first name, and the other was Bill Edge, who was a much younger man, and both of those were highly stimulating teachers, yes.
So you applied to read history at several universities or just Cambridge?
I think just Cambridge, as it happened. There was a family connection with Cambridge, and I can't remember applying to anywhere in addition to Cambridge. I think it was just Cambridge, and I got into Christ's College, yes, but then immediately had to do 2 years military service. In those days, it was obligatory. There was compulsory national service. So in 1952, in September 1952, I was called up and I went into the artillery, which my father had been in. I dabbled with being a conscientious objector at that time. I was rather, I had some anxiety about the army, but in the end, I was conscripted, and that was that. I didn't persist with any idea of becoming a conscientious objector.
And where did you go? Where did you?
I was called up to Oswestry, which was an absolutely foul place. Or in my recollection it was. No doubt it's a splendid place now, or no doubt even then it was a splendid place, but my experience of it was not. I mean, I remember going there in this rather bleak September, and the army system then was really pretty brutal, and we were basically, it was a system of organized humiliation. I well remember one Sunday during my basic training hearing a broadcast at that time about how during some years earlier it had become illegal to punish people by running round the barrack square with a rifle held over their heads, in their two hands over their heads like this. I looked out of the window, and then, as every day, there were people being punished by running round the barrack square holding a rifle above their heads. And that really summed it up for me. Sorry, I'm talking too loud.
You were talking about the sadism of the army.
Yes, so it was an exercise in kind of organized humiliation. I remember too, in the training for firing 25-pounder guns for the artillery, one of the effects, you have to kneel, and one of the effects of kneeling is it destroys the polished fronts of your boots. And so what they did was they had us working for days beforehand to get the most incredible finish on our boots, and then they took us on gun drill, which destroyed it. And it was that was what summed the army up for me at that time, an exercise in organized humiliation and really kind of breaking the spirit of recruits. And I thought that was just monstrous. And actually, one of the most useful things I think that my experience at Oswestry taught me, it gave me a lifelong hatred for all things military, which I think has been a very good lifelong lesson to have. I hate and despise the army, and I've no doubt that it's greatly changed now, but in those days it really was not an organization to be admired in any way. I don't think that it's acceptable to treat people in the way that they were treated. Anyway, what I did then was to seek a way, a means of escape. And my means of escape was to try to find some way of spending my 2 years productively away from the humiliations, as they then were, of ordinary military life. I managed to get on a course for military interpreters, and I was sent for for interview in London. Was interviewed in London, where I managed to convince people that I would be able to cope, and then went and started on an intensive course in Russian, where we were. The aim was, there were 2 levels of course. One was for translators and the other was for interpreters. And after a struggle, I got onto the higher level, the interpreters course, and we were sent to Cambridge. And so right here in Cambridge, in the Station Road, we did 8 hours of Russian a day, very intensive pressure. And they had the most marvelous system of sanctions that later on, when I was a university teacher, I rather wished that this form of sanction had been available to me. Every Friday we had exams. Every Friday morning there were 3 exams. We did, first of all, there would be dictation. Read out in Russian, write down in Russian. That's okay. Then there would be written interpretership, English into Russian, read out in English, write down in Russian. That was okay. The third one was horrific. Read out in Russian and write down in English. Because if you, for some reason, lost what it was about, if it was all about lions, and you didn't grasp that it was all about lions, you could get very low marks. And whereas with the other 2, it was very difficult to get very low marks in the dictation or working from English. But from Russian to English was really dangerous if you somehow or other lost track of it. Anyway, if you failed 2 weekly tests in a row, you put on your uniform and you went back to the army. And so lots of people actually failed 1 test, but almost nobody failed 2 tests. It was just it just wasn't on. And we went through this course at a huge rate. I mean, we did our O levels in a few weeks, and then the A levels a few weeks later, and we really pushed on. And really quite quickly we were reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Lermontov in the original. And actually, the course was taught by a mixture of Cambridge University teachers of Russian and of military people, often Russians, often Russian people who either had come out at the time of the revolution, or quite a lot of Soviet dissenters who'd come out during the war. And so it was that mixture of people who taught us. And of course the university people were very keen to teach us the glories of Russian literature. And so we did some military Russian, but an awful lot of it, the majority of our time was actually spent doing Russian literature. And by the end of the time, I mean, we really had a good knowledge of Russian and quite an extensive knowledge of Russian literature by the end of the 2 years. I mean, we completed the course shortly before the end of the 2 years. It was never put to any use. What the army was trying to do was, this was at the height of the Cold War. I mean, Stalin actually died during the time when I was being taught Russian, much to the excitement, I may say, of the teachers on the course, many of whom celebrated the death of Stalin. You know, for many of the people, this was an absolutely epoch-making event. But anyway, we completed our training, and there we were, a substantial reserve, many hundreds of people who had this qualification in Russia, and if there had been conflict, we would have been used for all sorts of things, listening into to pilots talking, you know, translating materials, interviewing prisoners, and all of those kinds of jobs. We weren't being trained as spies or anything like that. We were being trained as people who would be needed if there had been any sort of conflict in the ordinary run-of-the-mill military jobs which involved knowledge of another language. There was very little advantage for regular military personnel to learn Russian. It wasn't. It wouldn't lead them to an effective career in the army, or that appeared to us to be the case. And so the army's solution to this was to take these compulsory recruits, people who were compelled to be in the army for 2 years, and to select from those hundreds of people who they gave this training to. And I mean, I've always valued this. It taught me particularly that really, you know, learning a language is not a tremendously big deal. You know, you just get on with it, and you can get down to it and learn it. And
yes, I was going to ask. You mentioned in another interview how learning a click language with the Hadza was a major task you faced when you went to work with them.
yes.
And was this previous language experience helpful as a background to that difficult task?
Oh, it was certainly very useful, in the Russian particularly, but also the fact that I'd learned French at school and had a lower level knowledge of Spanish and Latin. It meant that, you know, that I understood the way that languages worked and was not inhibited by the idea of learning languages. In the field I had to learn 2 languages, but the language which really was difficult was Hadza, because it has a highly complex phonological system which wasn't understood at that time, with click consonants and other difficult phonological characteristics, which were really quite difficult to handle, but also a grammatically complex language, in which I had to spend a great deal of my time working out the grammar, which I did pretty systematically, and which, you know, the previous language experience with these European languages had given me a good background for taking that on.
Let's now perhaps move on to arriving to read a degree in, you'd been accepted presumably for history, and then you mentioned an interesting meeting you had. You wandered, I don't know how, you wandered accidentally into the archaeology and anthropology faculty, but you did, and who did you meet?
Yes, I mean, this was I was down to read, come to read history here, and undoubtedly if I'd come straight at the age of 18 to university, I would have done a history degree. There's no question of that. That was what I was supposed to do. After 2 years in the army, I wondered whether to actually to take up Russian, but there seemed rather little point because, you know, we'd read a lot of the literature and our knowledge of the language was quite advanced, and it seemed rather a waste of the 3 years, which I would certainly have done new material, but a lot of it would have been going over ground that I'd already gone over, and I thought that was rather a pity. But the history had kind of receded into the background, and I was really looking looking at other possibilities as well at that time. And my grandfather had always been interested in archaeology in Ireland. I was much influenced by my grandfather. And I thought I would go, and I was looking around in Cambridge for other possibilities and went into the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology. And there, just by chance, I met Maya Fortes, who I didn't know. He was a complete stranger to me. And I don't recall exactly how we the first contact went, but I think I probably asked him who he was or something like that. At any rate, we went back to his room, and I explained that I was trying to decide what subject I should study in Cambridge. And I was completely entranced by talking to Maya Fortes. Here he was, a full professor in Cambridge, who was willing to spend an hour of his time talking to somebody who had no knowledge of, who wasn't necessarily going to be a student in his department, but talking about his subject. And he was tremendously intrigued that I was interested in the possibilities of doing archaeology, or it was archaeology then that was the focus, because my grandfather had an interest in it, and he immediately launched into a discussion of the importance of grandfather-grandchild relationships. Absolutely fascinating, and I later came to know that that was a major focus of Maya Fortes' interests. And he was also, I also talked a bit about, my the way that I valued my shared identity as being both English and Irish. And he again launched into a great discussion of the great advantages in anthropology of being a kind of part outsider, not just a mainstream kind of person, because it gave a particular perspective on life and on events that he felt was a very useful background for anthropology. Anyway, I thought I was completely captivated by what Maya said, and I immediately enrolled for archaeology and anthropology. Within a matter of a few weeks, it became clear to me that it wasn't the archaeology that interested me, it was the anthropology. Before I met Maya and came to the first lectures in anthropology, I really had very little idea indeed of what anthropology was. But it was evident to me from within the first few weeks that I, by chance, had found the right subject. And there was never any doubt about it from that time. And it became a focus for my life and has remained so ever since.
And did Maya continue to have a great influence on you later on?
Yes, I was much influenced by Maya Fortes and enormously respected him and got to know him quite well personally too. His wife was Russian, and I used to sometimes go and talk Russian to her.
Was this Doris or his previous wife?
No, this was his previous wife, Sonia, yes. Who died either while I was an undergraduate or while I was a postgraduate. I think whilst I was still an undergraduate. A very warm and pleasant person. Anyway, I didn't see her very often, but from time to time I went and talked to her, and it was always a pleasure to talk a little Russian. And yes, I liked Maya enormously, and for me he was a kind of warm, paternal, basically authoritative figure, somebody who had a very kind of organized view of what anthropology was, and which I spent a lot of time trying to understand, and which seemed to me to make good sense, although to have its limitations. I found him Yes, I was really very greatly, I respected him and his anthropology greatly. And, really from the day of the first interview, I liked him a lot. Now, there were difficulties, of course. His books are very difficult to read, and particularly for a young undergraduate. And I can't say that his initial lectures were very impressive to a young undergraduate.
Didn't he?
He lectured on many subjects. He gave us introductory lectures, but he worked. They were kind of off the cuff, and often he seemed to pitch the level wrong, and I didn't feel that he was very good at that level. He was far better talking to postgraduates and to other academics. I thought that his talks certainly to starting undergraduates were less effective. But I mean, it's very hard, I think, for any academic to be equally effective at talking at all the various levels they're expected to talk at, to people just starting the subject, to those who already know the subject well, and then to talking to their fellow academics. Meyer did find it difficult, I think, to straddle that whole range, and I thought he was better I found him immensely stimulating when at the postgraduate seminars that I attended, but certainly less so as at my the first lectures I attended that he gave.
The other person who actually became your tutor or your supervisor, I suppose, was Edmund Leach.
Yes.
How did you get on with Edmund?
Well, Edmund was a wonderfully charismatic figure, and I mean, he was so exciting to have as a teacher. There was nobody to compare with him as a teacher. I mean, he was just wonderful. I wrote an essay for him every week, went to have the weekly supervision. Very often it took well over the hour. He would write long comments on every essay, sometimes, I may say, as long as the essay itself. But you never knew in advance the way that he would react. I mean, if he didn't like the essay, he would cross it all out in red, he was sometimes, you would get absolutely massive condemnation, red crossings out, and he would write in large red letters, "Rubbish!" And at other times he would be very enthusiastic and would take off from some idea one had put forward and turn it into something marvellous, which it certainly hadn't been in the essay. And, it was so stimulating, but also so disturbing, wondering which way it was going to go in that particular week. And later on, when I looked back at some of those essays, I don't know if I've still got them, I doubt if I have actually now, but when I look back at them, I realized just really that many of these assessments were really pretty arbitrary and were at any rate very exaggerated, but they were wonderfully stimulating as students, and tremendously, I mean, he was really wonderful at encouraging one to read widely on particular subjects and suggesting ways in which what one had written, how one could take off from there and go off in some new direction. Now, I found that tremendously stimulating, and he was a splendid teacher.
Were you aware as students of the tension between Meyer and Edmund?
The tension was at that stage as an undergraduate. He'd only just published his Political Systems of Highland Burma. That was published, I think, in 1954. Yeah. I started as a student it would have been in that year, in 54, and really I think that if there had been much tension at that time, I would have been aware of it, but I don't think there was much at that stage. It built up gradually over the years, and I think that the difficulties were really later difficulties. I think that was a very productive period for them both. I mean, it was really, you won't find, if you read Political Systems of Highland Burma, there isn't criticism of, as far as I recall, there's no criticism of the kind of approach that Maya Fortis was advocating in that book. That all came later, and I think it was really rather a productive phase at that time in which they were each working to develop their own material, and it was only later when each began to question the applicability of Maya's approach to his Asian material that the conflict really developed. So the answer to the question is, I wasn't aware as an undergraduate of much of significant conflict as far as I can recall, and I really don't think there was much conflict at that time. I think it was a later occurrence and built up over the years.
The other teachers were presumably Rio Fortune, and G.I. Jones was there by then? Or?
Yes. G.I. Jones was there, and he supervised me at one time, very much the ethnographer, very much concerned with West Africa, his particular area of interest. A pleasant and conscientious and energetic teacher, but not the kind of person who you look to for stimulus in the theory of anthropology. He was above all somebody who emphasized the merits of ethnography and being serious about the collection of ethnography, and that was valuable. But he wasn't the person to whom one looked for great insights into the nature of anthropology. Rio Fortune was the eccentric, was there around the department. He was having at that stage great difficulty in attracting anybody to go to his lectures, which were completely wild and really not much contribution, I think, to anything. And very much he was feeling extremely vitriolic in those days towards the memory of Malinowski, and used to spend much of the time in the lectures denouncing Malinowski and all of his works. It got a bit tiresome, actually, but Rio used to waylay undergraduates outside his lecture room, trying to get people to come in so that he could lecture to them. And it was a bad thing to be kind of anywhere near the entrance to the lecture room when Rio was giving his lecture at 11 in the morning. So we tended to take care to avoid being around at that particular time. It was difficult. I mean, I did go to some of his lectures, but really it wasn't very productive. What I did enjoy doing was going to lunch with Rio, and we used to go and have lunch in the then civic restaurant, the municipal restaurant, and we used to to enjoy conversations with Rio, making scurrilous remarks about all and sundry. And he was a nice, cheerful man, and very nice to talk to over lunch, but really not at that stage the person to talk to about, a person to listen to in lectures. Though we did read his book on Dobbu closely, and that's a very good book. And
Sorcerers of Dobbu. Yes.
Sorcerers of Dobbu, yes. I mean, that's an important book. Yeah. But really, he had. By 1954, he was already, I think, past the stage at which he was doing serious work in anthropology.
You were up with several contemporaries. You mentioned elsewhere Noah Yalman, the Harrises, Grace and Al Harris, and Frederick Barth. Is there anything to say about?
Yes, these weren't strictly speaking contemporaries. I mean, these were postgraduates while I was an undergraduate, and the system of teaching in Cambridge is one in which postgraduates do a lot of the teaching and do supervisions. I was supervised by all of these people, by Jean Lafontaine, by Grace and Al Harris, by Noah Yalman, and by Frederick Bath. And I found that enormously stimulating. All fresh back from the field, all bursting with new ideas and new material. And I found that tremendously stimulating, and I well remember those encounters. They were a great source of encouragement. And I think the system in which postgraduates are heavily involved in teaching doesn't always work awfully well, but certainly in those cases, I thought it was tremendously valuable. Certainly in my Cambridge education, all of those people had a great effect on me. As in those days, there were really rather few undergraduates in Cambridge, and there wasn't the degree of separation between undergraduates and postgraduates that later developed. I mean, we used to meet socially, and as undergraduates, we were able to, those of us who were determined and enthusiastic, were often able to infiltrate into seminars and lectures which were really intended for postgraduates. And so long as there weren't too many of us, nobody really cared. In fact, people probably were rather pleased. But there wasn't the separation that later developed was very much a product of numbers, and also of the kind of greater institutionalization of universities that developed in the 1960s.
You used to go off to the bun shop.
Yes, we used to, and to the mill and to other places, and yes, and talk. And so it was a kind of, the atmosphere was one in which really we were able to talk to, as undergraduates, to talk to anybody. And there was far less formality and separation than later developed.
So did you decide while you were an undergraduate that you wanted to go on and do a PhD?
Yes, I mean, particularly in my second year, it became clear to me that if an opportunity developed, and in those days there were extremely few posts in anthropology and extremely few, it's very difficult indeed to get research grants. People often complained later on about how it become much more difficult to get research grants. I don't believe that was the case at all. I believe it was far more difficult in the 1950s to get funding for research than it was later. There were, academic posts at the time when I was trying to get an academic post in the early 1960s were really extremely few and very difficult indeed to obtain, and an awful lot depended on luck, and I was lucky. Now, yes, by my second year, I had already become interested in the possibility of doing a PhD and maybe going on after a PhD in anthropology, and started searching around for places to work. And I wanted to work somewhere exotic and isolated and miles from anywhere, that would kind of bring together my interest that I developed in childhood in the countryside and my interest in wild nature with my interest that I developed in anthropology in what might be described as isolated peoples, of peoples with a close identification with the wilderness. And that led me to focus on hunter-gatherers. But not just on hunter-gatherers. In my third and final year, I started applying for field research grants. And I had three. I applied to work in three quite separate areas. I applied to work, first of all, with a group that later became known as the Yanomamo. In those days, they had a rather different name. And there was rather little written. There were some missionary accounts, but really not much material, but enough to see that they were a fascinating group. I put in I applied to a number of grant-giving bodies to work there, and those applications failed. I didn't get anywhere with them. I also applied to work in New Guinea, and the Australian National University was advertising research grants to work in New Guinea, and I applied to work with a group that in those days were called the Kuku Kuku, and who subsequently became known as the Baruya. And I actually received funding from the Australian National University to work with the Baruya, and I was very tempted to take this up. The funding was generous. John Barnes was then in the department, was then, I think, head of department at the ANU, and it was a very attractive place to work. I knew John Barnes' work and greatly admired it, and so I was very attracted by that possibility. But in the end, I accepted the third project, and this was I had become very interested in African hunter-gatherers. Now, the data at that time on African hunter-gatherers was really very inadequate. The data on the pygmies was dominated by a completely outdated paradigm developed in Germany by Schebester and others, and Father Schmidt. And really completely outdated and unsatisfactory. The work on the Bushmen really hadn't moved on much from the splendid compilation by Isaac Shapira in the Khoisan peoples of South Africa, although new work had started by Lorna Marshall. At that time, scarcely any of it had been published. It was just beginning to be published. And really very little was known about the Bushmen at that stage. There had been a student from Cambridge who'd attempted to work among the Bushmen, but who had been but who had such ecological difficulties in doing the work that his work had been a failure, and I was discouraged from working among the Bushmen by that story. I can't remember what the name of the person was, but it was held up as a cautionary tale at that time. This was long before Richard Lee went to the Kalahari. I became interested in East African savanna hunters, among whom there had been no modern work. And the group that was of particular interest were people who at that time were called by three names. They were called the Hadzapi, they were called the Kangeju, and they were called the Kindiga. There had been two brief but fairly recent articles on them, one written by a game man called Cooper, and an article on material culture written by a colonial administrator called Henry Fosbrook, who had been an administrator in an area close to the Hadza and subsequently became government anthropologist in Tanganyika, as it then was. And I met him. He came on a visit to Cambridge would have been 1956, I think. I met him on a visit to Cambridge, and he was able to assure me that the Hadza had not been sedentarized, that they were still living a fully nomadic way of life. He was very skeptical about whether it would be possible to live with them. He said that what I should do was to base myself in the nearest government center and to send out people to bring in Hadza and interview them in the government center. An idea that I completely rejected out of hand. It seemed to me to be an appalling way of approaching field research. But the key thing that he told me was that the people were there and living a nomadic way of life, and that they hadn't been, they hadn't, like so many other groups already had by that time, forcibly sedentarized. Anyway, I applied to a number of different bodies and got a number of grants, £100 here, £100 there, small amounts of money, and eventually was able to put these together and get enough to do field research among them. And this was very much my own project, much more than the Baruya one would have been. That was very much the ANU's project for which they were recruiting people. The Hadza project was my own project. It was nobody else's. And that was what I did, and I never regretted that.
You were supervised by Maya, were you?
No, I wasn't actually. I was.
Aidan Southall?
Well, it was complicated because, yes, in East Africa, while I was out there, I was the head of the East African Institute of Social Research at Makerere University in Uganda, which was then the only university in East Africa. So I went from Makerere to work in Tanganyika, many hundreds of miles away. But yes, so basically, yes, Aidan Southall had responsibility for me while I was out there, and I used to go back to the Institute of Social Research every 6 months for conferences, which really didn't have anything much to do with hunter-gatherers, but which were very academically stimulating, which I always greatly enjoyed. And I used to talk to Aidan and others at the Institute a great deal about my work, and although it all seemed very strange to them, I mean, what became apparent really from quite early days during my research is that African hunter-gatherers were really neither like African peasant farmers or pastoralists. They didn't have elaborated lineage systems or other kinship systems of that sort. They had no clans or lineages or the kind of binding ties between generations which are characteristics of those systems in Africa, but nor did they have systems like Australian ones. I mean, Maya seemed to think that in Africa I might, if I was really lucky, encounter systems that were a bit like Australia, you know, really wonderfully elaborated kinship and ritual systems, which were a kind of echo of the Australian systems. Or I might find some system which was which had some real definable relation to the kind of system that he had analyzed among African peasant farmers. Now, in fact, what I found was something quite different from either of those, a system of very flexible social relationships, which really didn't look at all like what was going on in other well-described African societies, but also didn't really look like Australia either.
How extensive was your fieldwork training for this exercise? I think in those days, from other accounts I've heard, it was not exactly the format that the Economic and Social Research Council nowadays would think was approvable.
It wasn't just not the format, it was non-existent. There wasn't any training. I mean, it was extraordinary, and I think disgraceful. I mean, I think it was really thoroughly reprehensible. The view was, well, you'd done an undergraduate degree, and off you went to the field, and studied some group, and then came back and wrote a PhD about them. Now, this was just crazy. I mean, I must say that when I arrived in the field, I had extremely little idea of what I was supposed to be doing. I had very little idea of what techniques I might apply to obtain information. I also had although I'd read widely on hunter-gatherers, I hadn't kind of put it all together. I hadn't thought I hadn't had to write a research proposal, so I hadn't really developed a set of ideas about what I might look for, or what I should be looking for. And so both at the level of developing hypotheses and at the level of practicalities of fieldwork, how you actually set about it, what you do. Well, it was a situation of gross ignorance and really very unsatisfactory. Now, going to the East African Institute of Social Research in Makerere was a great help. It really was. So I took my first degree in June. By November, I was at the Institute. And there were a whole lot of other people doing field research who came in for conferences, and one learnt enormously from what they were doing. Their papers were very much focused on what they were actually doing. But also Aidan Southall took us on, took me and another newly arrived researcher also from Cambridge called Gehan Wijewardena, who was working on the Kenyan coast, and also the coast of Tanganyika, took us to do a piece of basically ethnographic survey work in Uganda for a week or two. And that was a real eye-opener. In that case, we worked very much through the administrative structure. Went and talked to the local chief, who found us people to talk to. But I mean, in the course of a few days, we were able to learn a huge amount about an ethnically very diverse area, a very mixed area, which was all kind of surface stuff, but was extremely rich and detailed. And I was amazed at the amount of data that was accessible in that way. Now, of course, it was impossible to judge the material adequately in a few days, and impossible to deal with topics that were in any way sensitive. But it was still a very valuable exercise.
Going back a bit to the postgraduate seminars which Maya used to run, and which you obviously attended both as an undergraduate and afterwards, and Edmund famously used to attend these, and how was his presence felt?
Well, I mean, it created a kind of air of excitement among all of those attending the seminar, because Edmund would almost always have something to say, and so would Maya, and occasionally what they said would involve conflict, and Edmund was a kind of loose cannon, and you never knew quite what he was going to say, but mostly I thought that the discussions were productive and actually took the ideas forward. But it's always a difficult situation, I think, when you have a kind of established figure with a very well thought out and worked out paradigm, which Maya had, and then you have a flamboyant and charismatic character trying to redraw a very different paradigm, because the first paradigm doesn't work for his data. And so it was a difficult situation, an intrinsically difficult one, and the difficulties derived both from the difference in personality between Leach and Forties, but also from their very different experiences in the field and the very different nature of the data that they were gathering. I felt that the relationship between Leach and Forties became unproductive later, because what happened was Forties became preoccupied with Leach's attack on his paradigm, and I think he should have really not bothered about that too much, and he should have got on with developing his own wonderful insights into the West African data. And I think for him it was a diversion, And I think particularly Fortey's studies of ritual could and should have been much more elaborate and developed if he'd somehow left aside Asia and Edmund's approach to the Asian data and got on with his own wonderful insights into the African data. And I think that would have been much more a much more productive use of his time and energies. So it did have, in the end, I thought, that rather a negative aspect to it. Though, I mean, I think the published analyses of Fortey's and Leach and the way that they interacted are interesting. I think it would have been more productive, in fact, if Fortey's in particular had spent his time on developing his own analysis further.
Another member of that, or slightly junior to them, was Jack Goody. Did you have much contact with Jack?
Yes, I had quite a lot of contact with Jack, who supervised my PhD for a while, which wasn't an easy situation because Jack's work was within peasant Africans, with African farmers, and the data that I was producing was very different from that. I was very much influenced by his book Death, Property and the Ancestors, which I think is one of the particularly exciting pieces of Jack's work. I value that enormously. I think that's an enormously valuable book. But actually, it's valuable to me because of the dramatic contrasts that exist between the attitudes to death and property from those that exist among the people he studied and those that applied to the Hadza. I mean, the Hadza, whom I worked with, among them, property is perceived very negatively. Any property must be shared. There's an obligation to share. Accumulation of property is wicked and antisocial. And if you have more property than you can immediately use, if you have more personal possessions, bows, arrows, tobacco, smoking pipes, money, anything like that, if you have more than you have immediate use for, by immediate I mean use for in the next day or two, then you should share it. If you have 2 shirts, you should give one away, possibly even both away. But the idea of the immorality of accumulation, which is very strong among the Hadza, and really the obligation to share, which is a moral obligation and a political necessity, and it's an unavoidable one. People come under absolutely relentless pressure to share what they have. They're just besieged by others to give away. It's other people's are entitled to it. Sharing is not an act of generosity among the Hadza. You don't share in order to, you don't give to people so that you can receive later. It's not that at all. It's a moral obligation to give what you have without expectation of return. I've published an article which brings this out, but people still think of sharing as a kind of...
Is this the one on egalitarian society?
No, this is an article specifically on sharing. And but I think that anthropology has been very damaged by the emphasis on reciprocity, which is a particular notion that is elaborated in some societies to a very great extent. I mean, most notably in the Trobriand Islands, where it's enormously important, which is why Malinowski developed the idea of it. It's built into Trobriand culture in a very fundamental way, and in all societies it applies to some extent. You obviously interact with other people, and if they treat you decently and interact with you in a way that recognizes your presence, well then obviously that creates a basis for a reasonable relationship. But the idea that reciprocity is the fundamental force in human behavior is just absurd. I mean, it isn't. A great deal of human behavior is based on the notion that people have obligations, and obligations in the Hadza case are very much focused on the obligation to give any property, any objects that you possess for which you have no immediate need, to other members of your community without expectation of return. And, you know, again, if you think of in our own society, there are many contexts where this also applies. We don't think that the relation between mother and child ought to be one of reciprocity. It's a mother's obligation to give to her infant child without expectation of return. Yes, in later life there may be return, but the mother, in giving to her child, in suckling her child, in looking after her child, the idea that that's based on a notion of reciprocity is absurd. It's just absurd. And I think this is deeply damaging to anthropology, the preoccupation with reciprocity. We should look at reciprocity as one social mode, a very important social mode, but there are all sorts of other things going on in human interaction which cannot be reduced to reciprocity.
The mention of giving away and levelling of wealth, you're well known for your work on equality and societies. Was this something that had interested you before you went, or was it something that grew as you discovered how much stress there was on equalising?
I think it developed particularly out of my research. Yes, I'd had an interest in it. It would have been very hard to have been brought up in this country in the post-war period, when there were all sorts of, when the National Health Service was developed, and when all sorts of new ideas about equality and equal opportunity were being developed politically. It would have, of course, I was interested in those ideas as a young person at that time. But really, it was the experience of seeing the emphasis in equality in operation among the Hadza that developed my ideas in this subject. I mean, the Hadza are totally preoccupied with equality, and in their case, I mean, the equality is asserted. It's not, you know, the idea that hunter-gatherers are equal simply because they're at a kind of, I don't know, at a simple, at an early stage of evolution. This kind of notion that they have equality because they haven't, you know, there hasn't been a chance for hierarchy to develop is absurd. In order to have equality, you have, of the sort that the Hadza have, you have to have a series of mechanisms which prevent people from accumulating property, which prevent them from asserting their differential wealth, their differential status, and their differential power. And what is so striking about the Hadza is the way that differences of power, wealth, and status are systematically subverted. So it's not a kind of negative situation. It's not just the absence of hierarchy. It's in order to have the kind of equality that exists among the Hadza, you have to have all sorts of mechanisms which promote this equality and maintain it in existence. These are elaborate institutionalized mechanisms which constantly create and recreate equality between people. Anybody attempting to assert control over other Hadza, to assert power over them, there are immediately mechanisms come into play which prevent that being effective. And of course, in the potential for inequality exists in all societies. The Hadza are tremendously conscious that there will be constantly other Hadza who attempt to acquire more wealth or more power or more status than other people. And without the mechanisms which destroy those attempts, the kind of egalitarian system that they have couldn't exist. So it's an egalitarian system. It's one in which equality is actively promoted. And the reason why this kind of system exists, not among all hunter-gatherers or anything like all of them, but among a significant group of hunter-gatherers, is because the way of life as hunter-gatherers permits this kind of equality to exist. It's made possible by the fact that people's attachment to the land and other and movable property is such that it is possible to maintain an equal system. If you're a peasant farmer, you have to have some continuity in your occupancy of the land, and so you have to have. You also have to have control over the labour of the junior members of your family. You can't operate as a peasant farmer unless you're able to control the labour of, unless there is a household head who's able, at any rate to some degree, to control the labour of other members of his household, or his or her household, the labour of if you have a male household head, of the wives and the children. And it's very striking in many African societies that actually most of the work is done by junior members of the household. That's not necessary among hunter-gatherers, and it's possible to operate the system without that control over land or over the labour of other people. And that's why there is the potential to have these kinds of egalitarian systems.
This is connected, obviously deeply connected. You made a distinction. You said this was a group of hunter-gatherer societies, but not all. And one of the ways in which you've influenced the discipline a lot is that distinction between different kinds of hunters and gatherers. I was wondering whether you can remember how you came to realise this distinction and what exactly it is. This is the...
Yes, I mean it's hard to talk about this in a simple and straightforward way, because of course it's become an enormously complex and elaborated distinction. But basically it's a distinction between what I call an immediate return system, in which people get an immediate return for their labour, and that stands in contrast with what I call delayed return systems, in which people apply their labour and get a return typically weeks or months or years later. Now, just to draw the contrast simply, let's make it first of all between immediate return hunter-gatherers and delayed return societies in general. Now, in almost all agricultural and pastoral societies, people put their labour into the land and then get their harvest months later. And you have to have some system of social relations which allows people to apply their labour systematically, and then at the end of it to get a yield on their labour, and to control the yield that they have got, their harvest, until they then start the cycle over again. With pastoralists, you've got an even more delayed system in which you invest in your flocks, and over a period of years, you gradually increase your stocks and build up your herds. And in pastoralists, most of the labour typically comes from young unmarried men whose marriage has been delayed. That labour is controlled by the household head, and the sons or other junior members of the household work for their father with the expectation of eventually inheriting the herd into which they have put their labour. So a system of long delayed yields in which the household head has considerable control, is entitled to considerable respect, and where the counterpart to the power is a kind of elaborate ritualization of the role of the household head and the father, particularly marked in the case of pastoralists. Now, in the hunter-gatherer situation, it's completely different because people can go off hunting or gathering and get an immediate yield from their labor. There is no way that a father can control his sons and derive benefit from their labor with the expectation of return. He doesn't have anything to which he can give to his sons if they apply their labor for the benefit of their father. The only way in which you can control the labor of young men is if you have a system of highly elaborate ritualized property, and the Australian Aborigines are the really striking case of this. You have the older men who control a body of assets which consist above all of ritual knowledge. It's property, but it's above all non-material property. It's property in the form of knowledge which is enormously valued, and the labor of young men is very much geared to getting access to this body of knowledge. So it doesn't have to be material property. In fact, very often this non-material property is at least as potent as access to material property. And in many cases, the really valuable assets that exist in hunter-gatherer delayed return societies. I should say that hunter-gatherers are divided into those that have immediate return systems and those that have delayed return systems. Now, in those that have delayed return systems, very often the property that is there, that is controlled by senior men, is of this, it's intellectual property, non-material property, and it is that which provides the basis for the power and the status and the wealth of the senior generation. Now, in Africa, you have both delayed return systems among hunter-gatherers and immediate return ones. You have both. Although delayed return systems are unusual, what is very striking is that delayed return systems of hunter-gatherer systems can change rather easily into agricultural systems. And my belief is that it's likely that there will have been many more delayed return hunter-gatherer systems in the past, but will have over time rather been kind of pre-adapted for transition to agriculture. Now, the most striking case of delayed return hunter-gatherers in Africa today are people called the Okiek in Kenya. Their delayed return system was based on honey. And we call them hunter-gatherers, and they hunted a lot, but they also specialized in gathering honey. And they didn't just gather wild honey, although they did do this, but they also had beehives. So really, in a way, we call them hunter-gatherers, but it's not just exploitation of the wild, it's also a productive system. They had beehives, and they controlled the land on which the beehives were placed, and they had clans and lineages which actually controlled these assets. And if you look at their social relations have many resemblances to the social relations, the system of social relations that is familiar among African peasant farmers, with household heads having very much more control over assets than they do among immediate return hunter-gatherers, with there being not the same emphasis on generalized sharing that you have immediate returners. And you also find that nowadays that very many Okiek have changed to farming and combine farming with hunting and gathering, whereas immediate returners find it very difficult to do this. The problem for immediate returners is that it's very difficult to control the labour of junior members of your own household, and it's actually quite difficult because people are so accustomed to the idea that everything has to be shared. It's very difficult for people to maintain rights to their harvest and not to share it immediately when it's obtained. Very often, I mean, my experience of seeing immediate returners cultivating is that the maize is picked long before it's ripe and consumed. There's no seed to go through to the next year. Very difficult just to maintain the system. Very difficult to get labour applied systematically. System of social relations doesn't lend itself to agriculture. So typically what we find in the modern world is hunter-gatherers and former hunter-gatherers, and there are more former hunter-gatherers around, recognized former hunter-gatherers, than there are hunter-gatherers nowadays, is practicing some agriculture, yes, but practicing it effectively, very few. Very often it's really practiced, but not very effectively, without very effective control over the labour of junior members of the household or of the harvest once it's obtained. And typically hunter-gatherers do a lot of immediate return activity by working for food on the land of neighbouring farmers, in which they get an immediate yield for their labour, rather than doing much agriculture for themselves.
Which is rather similar to Nurit Bird David's idea about wage gathering, if you remember.
Yes, yes, yes.
First, the last question I'd like to ask you really is, you've spent an amazingly long time in the field, 3 or 4 years, and you've been back again and again and again. Can you just sort of explain the attraction of working and living with the Hadza?
Well, I mean, this is a complicated problem. I often wonder whether I would have been better to do the more usual thing in anthropology, which is to go to do detailed studies of 2 or 3 different groups. I think that the Hadza are perennially fascinating for a number of reasons. They've attracted not just me, but many other researchers. But they are a highly distinctive group, and a very interesting group for that reason, quite distinct from their neighbours. And really my work has been very much geared to trying to understand the nature of that distinctiveness, their linguistic distinctiveness, their social distinctiveness, and their other aspects of this situation. I think that the language point has always been very important to me. I think it's been a source of major disappointment, really, that little of the subsequent research among the Hadza by social researchers has involved people learning the language properly. And I think this is a great pity. Far too much of the more recent work has been done through Swahili. And although all sorts of things can be discovered in this way, I do think it's a limitation not being able to understand people's ordinary conversations with each other. Now, I don't understand everything, and particularly now that I'm becoming increasingly deaf, I do have a problem in understanding all of the casual conversation. But what I always know is what it's about. I always know what people are talking about, even if I don't get all of the details, and then I can ask people about it. And I do think that's important. So, yes, so and really, the Hadza are such a striking case. Their social relations are so strikingly distinctive that they've represented an enduring challenge and one that has occupied me throughout the years. There's also been another element to it too. The Hadza have had an absolutely terrible time in recent years, with increasing theft of their land by their neighbours. Most of the land that they had when I started work among them in the 1950s has been stolen. The Hadza in some areas are living as paupers on land grabbed from them, stolen from them by their agricultural neighbours, in a situation in which there's extreme discrimination against them. Now, the Hadza in those contexts are angry and bitterly resentful, and there's a kind of obligation. There's an obligation that I certainly feel as somebody who has some knowledge of their background, to try to help them in this situation. Now, the help I've been able to give has been limited, but I do think that it's an appalling situation and one that needs to be given wider recognition. I've published on the subject. I would say that the publications that I've written have had really rather a limited impact, and that's a great disappointment to me. And the Hadza are angry with everybody. They're angry with the neighbours who've stolen their land. They're angry with the government. They're angry with researchers, including often with me, because they feel they've been let down by everybody. And I think their situation is a terrible one. I think it really is awful. And every day I hear accounts of new difficulties that they're encountering. Now, a lot of people, Hadza and others, have made huge efforts to try to do something about the situation, but without, it's fair to say, a great deal of success so far. Somehow or other, the right, the entitlement of hunter-gatherers to retain their land and to think out for themselves and work out for themselves their own future on that land is a fundamental human right, and it is obvious that that future should, if the Hadza themselves wanted, be a blend of the economic potentialities of the land. Some hunting and gathering in the residual, as far as that's possible, in the residual land that exists, combined with the exploitation of other economic opportunities that exist there. Some agriculture for those who choose to practice agriculture. Some earning of wages from working on the land of other people. And some acting as tourist guides, the exploitation of the range of economic opportunities. It's not for outsiders to tell them what to do. What they need is land and a recognition of their entitlement to live in the way that they choose and to develop the economic opportunities as they wish to develop them, not just as a group, but also as individuals within the group. Now, that's absolutely fundamental, but there's very little acceptance and recognition of this. People are always devising new scenarios about how the Hadza ought to live. It's not for other people to tell them, it's for them to decide how they want to live, just as it is for every other human group. But they need the land in order to be able to do that. And if they're living as impoverished paupers, they then have no choices.
Thank you very much. That's a very eloquent statement. One of the things you did there and you're famous for is your interest in film in anthropology. And so you've recorded their lives and other things with in texts and writings. But could you just say something? You've been very closely associated with the use of film and the development of the Royal Anthropological Institute film festivals and archives and so on. What do you think is the role of film in anthropology?
I think film has been important in a whole lot of different ways within anthropology. I must say that I think the most important role of film is to provide a resource for the people who are filmed to use in future. I mean, the film that I made on the Hadza, I made it above all for the Hadza. And what I hope is that in 100 years' time, the Hadza will look at that film, think about it, and that it'll be useful to them as a resource for them. And I think that's the major importance of ethnographic film. That's the one I put absolutely top of the list, that it's a means of recording ways of life that will be very difficult for people to understand and appreciate without the visual material. So that for me is primary, but it is also actually very valuable in teaching. And at the Royal Anthropological Institute, from the time in the 1960s, what we were determined to do was to develop a library of ethnographic films that could be used in teaching, and that could also be used by people who were going to do field work in a particular area, who wanted to see what the place looked like and to think about, about the people of the area, that it could be a resource. Now, our preoccupation at the RAI was always in making the many films that were being made, in making them available. There was a real problem when we started that really quite a number of films were being made, but hardly any of them were being made available. Its distribution was the major problem in this country, and it actually remains the major problem in most places. And film in teaching, now modern digital techniques make it far easier to incorporate pieces of film into lectures. There was always a problem with doing this when film was with 16mm film, but now it should be very much easier to do that effectively, and I would like to see that used much more widely than it is. There are still many films which are not in effective distribution. I mean, the wonderful films made by Melissa Llewellyn-Davis on the Maasai, many of those are still completely unavailable at the BBC. They haven't made them available effectively for teaching purposes, and I think that's disgraceful and despicable, because they are actually among the most valuable teaching films ever made, although made primarily for television. There is a kind of intrinsic conflict, much less so now with the change in technology, between doing field research and filming. I mean, in the days of 16mm, if you were going to concentrate on, if you were going to do filming, and a dispute, say, broke out, and you rushed for your camera rather than for your notebook, I think it could get in the way of doing good field research. And I, on the whole, believe that at that time, the right way of using film was to do your basic research and then to go back on a separate expedition and to film, in which you would apply the knowledge that you had learnt during earlier work and be able to make a film following up particular themes that you had developed earlier. We had, particularly in the past, but even today it's the case, we have an extraordinary situation that people making ethnographic film have very often seen a very limited range of ethnographic films themselves. It's extraordinary when talking to ethnographic filmmakers how many of them are ignorant of the techniques that have been developed over the years by ethnographic filmmakers and really haven't thought adequately about the range of techniques, the range of different ways of making films. And it's really, my comments on this would be really very much like those comments that I made earlier about lack of preparation for field research. The preparation for field research and the techniques of field research in anthropology are essential, and equally, anybody who wants to make a serious ethnographic film should really work hard at viewing a range of ethnographic films and thinking, what kind of film do I want to make? What am I going to do about a commentary or subtitles? What am I going to, what kind of material am I going to use? How am I going to use it? And to think about all of these things carefully before filming, and preferably to do a few trial films and to show them to other ethnographic filmmakers. And I just don't think it's good practice to do as so many people do today, which is to rush off with a camera and to make a film without having looked at the splendid corpus of ethnographic film that exists, including, you know, a very wide range of different techniques, some of which are useful, well, which are useful in a range of different contexts and which need to be thought about carefully, properly prepared for. The other thing is that I do think that it's essential that ethnographic filming should be based on really sound ethnographic knowledge, and far too often ethnographic knowledge we have, particularly if you watch television ethnographic films nowadays, I mean, many of them are just disgraceful for their ignorance. But the role of I mean, there are many now with modern technology. The role of film is very diverse, and it should certainly be used much more extensively in teaching now that the technology makes this so much easier.
Thank you. Well, just the last topic I wanted to raise was, you, as I mentioned right at the beginning, you were one of my lecturers when I went to the LSE in 1967, and I remember those lectures. In fact, I have them still, my notes, and I use them in my teaching. When I lecture on kinship and economics, I use my notes on your lectures, 1967.
God must know.
But you were therefore the contemporary of my teachers. My supervisor was Shapira. I was there in the last years of Lucy Mayer, Raymond Firth, Robin Fox, and then the new generations of Alfie Gels and Maurice Blocks and Jean Lafontaine's. Are there one or two of them who, as colleagues, you particularly single out as someone who you were influenced by or got on well with or would like to remember?
Well, there were so many. I mean, it's it's very hard to be selective because I was influenced by many people. I mean, I had in the early days, I was very impressed by Raymond Firth. I mean, really such an outstanding figure, so outgoing, so his ability to cope with any situation, his performance in seminars was exemplary. I mean, really a very stimulating and enormously important influence. I was very struck by Maurice Friedman, the sinologist who became, for a short while, head of the department at the convener of the department, as we used to call the head of department at the LSE. I thought that he was absolutely excellent in his willingness to consult with junior colleagues, the way that he was able to interact with other staff and to create a coherent department in which people were able to develop their own interests and to build up a really effective range of interests. I thought he was absolutely excellent at the LSE. I admired him enormously. He subsequently went off to Oxford, which really wasn't a good move on his part. I think he found it very much more difficult there because the anthropological tradition there was very different from the one that he was used to. I do wish that he had stayed on at the LSE. I admired him enormously. I had very great respect for him. in recent years, I've been tremendously attracted by the work of Johnny Parry. I think that, I mean, it's hard to single out Johnny from among the many people who've been doing good work at the LSE, but certainly at a personal level, I have found Johnny's work particularly stimulating. I think his work on his paper on the gift is an absolutely outstanding piece of work, which I find enormously valuable. You know, if one's thinking about work on property, as I have obviously done a lot, I think that paper and its discussion of Moses' work is enormously perceptive. So I've learnt a huge amount from Johnny Parry, even though he's working in a totally different field. I've certainly within anthropology, I've learnt in recent years as much from Johnny as from anybody else. So those are people whom I would select, but it is a bit invidious, yes, because there are very many other people who I think very positively about, from whom I have learnt a lot.
So the last question, which you don't really need to answer if you don't want to, thinking of this interview being viewed in 100 years or 50 years, is there any sort of final message for the future, which or anything you'd like to say about anthropology or your life, last reflections to them?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is please, anybody watching this interview, please read my stuff. Don't just listen to my off-the-cuff remarks. I mean, I do feel that on a number of the topics I've touched on, that what I have said has been very inadequate, and I would like to see the people look more closely at the kinds of arguments that I've developed on equality, on sharing, and on other such topics. The other thing that I'd particularly like to say in conclusion is to comment on the appalling discrimination against hunter-gatherers in Africa and in other parts of the world today. And I think that Africans will look back in horror at the breaches of human rights that are occurring. We're talking about a tiny minority of people who don't constitute any kind of political threat, but who, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa in general, and the very many countries in which residual groups of hunter-gatherers and recognized former hunter-gatherers exist, the extent to which they have been forcibly moved from their land, or their land has been stolen by their neighbors, is something that is disgraceful and really needs attention, and it's a very serious human rights abuse. Now, in the past in Africa, I was very reluctant to criticize Africans strongly, because they were having to put up with the horrors of apartheid, and in some places the horrors of colonial administration too. Nowadays, when I think that it's very important that the same kinds of criticism that I am applying to discrimination in this country and in other parts of the world is applied to Africa as well. And the discrimination against hunter-gatherers and former hunter-gatherers is a very serious breach of human rights practiced by Africans against other Africans, and I would like to see this recognized and acted on, and the political will to act on this needs to be developed. There are African activists now conscious of this in a number of African countries, but not yet enough. The time will come when more people are conscious of it. I just hope it happens before it's too late, while there are still hunter-gatherers who still have land to be safeguarded. I fear that it may be too late. I mean, we should remember that in the case of the appalling genocide in Rwanda, that the population that actually lost the highest percentage of its members in the genocide were the tiny minority of the Batwa, who, constituting less than 1% of the total population of Rwanda, but who lost what was almost certainly, in the genocide, a higher percentage of their population than the Hutu or the Tutsi, the Tutsi lost a high percentage, but nothing approaching the numbers lost by the Batwa. And that's just not recognized. We need to recognize what is happening. We need to open our eyes and to get international recognition for this fact. And before it's too late, before more cases of discrimination occurs. Now, the Rwandan case is a very extreme one, obviously, but the loss of land is general, and it's that needs to be challenged. And particularly in the case of the most numerous of the hunter-gatherer groups in Africa, which are the many groups that in the tradition, in the literature, are usually described as pygmies. The people, the hunter-gatherers of the tropical forests of the Congo-Kinshasa, the Congo-Brazzaville, the Central African Republic, Gabon, and the other countries in which they occur, where land rights are very rarely recognized. And very many of these groups that are very numerous, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, where the land rights are being totally neglected. Agricultural peoples very often have a struggle to maintain their land rights, but it's nothing like the problem that exists for hunter-gatherers. We do need to recognize this. We can't have a situation like the Australian ones, like the Australian one in the early years of colonization, where the Europeans going to Australia described it as an empty country and totally ignored the land rights of Australian Aborigines. We do have a comparable situation today in parts of the tropical forested areas of Africa, where Africans regard the forest used by hunter-gatherers as an empty land, as a land which is just free for other people to help themselves to. That's just as unacceptable today in Africa as it was for Europeans to seize the land of the Aborigines in Australia.